Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Hello and welcome back. This is Daniel Clark here with the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we interview leading wildlife photographers, conservationists, and scientists to learn more about the awe-inspiring species that we share this fascinating planet with. Guests of the podcast have traveled to the edges of the world to observe, photograph, study, and support wildlife in their natural environment, and as you probably can imagine, now have some of the most exciting, scary, crazy, extreme, and beautiful stories that I have ever heard. Today's guest is Anand Varma, a photographer with a degree in integrative biology from UC Berkeley. Now he helps biologists communicate their research through photographs and tell the story behind the science of complex issues. His TED Talk on the first 21 days of a bee's life is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. You have to check it out. I'll link it in the show notes. But we talk about that, as well as mind-controlling parasites, hummingbirds, glow-in-the-dark mushrooms, and much, much more on this absolutely mind-blowing episode. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So without further ado, here is my conversation with the one and only Anand Varma. Well, thank you so much, Anand, for taking the time. I'm super excited to talk to you. I think you have one of the most unique styles of photography, especially in kind of the wildlife science world that I've seen thus far, and really interested to learn more. But I wanted to start off kind of with the topic that is most interesting to me because of a project that I'm working on right now, which is the overpopulation of feral cats in Hawaii. And one of the big problems there, it has to do with Toxoplasma gondii, which is a protozoan parasite that essentially hacks into the minds of rodents and other cat prey, making them more likely to be attracted to cat scents and then thus more likely to be predated on by a cat. And a lot of the work you've done is in mind suckers. And one specific video that I saw was about a ladybug that was essentially turned into a zombie. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for me?
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure how much background or context you want, but the first story I photographed for National Geographic was on these parasites that have the power to control the minds and bodies of their hosts. So we kind of call them mind suckers for short. And there's a couple of examples that I photographed for that story that the parasite actually turns its host into a bodyguard. So in the case of this ladybug, there's a wasp that attacks the ladybug and lays a single egg in its body. And that egg hatches, and the larva feeds on the ladybug. It crawls out, and to transform into an adult, it has to go through this metamorphosis in a cocoon. And that's a very vulnerable stage of its life. It can't move. It's focusing on changing into an adult, and it's figured out how to leave behind some kind of a signal that controls the ladybug that's still alive, even though it's been partially eaten. And the ladybug hangs around, and it stands on top of the cocoon and wiggles its body to basically effectively scare off any insect predators that come by.
That is bizarre. Where was this? Or where is it typically found in nature?
It's found in North America, this particular interaction. I photographed it in Montreal, where a graduate student named Fanny Morey was studying the ecology of this interaction. So she was finding that basically the parasite has an incentive to keep this ladybug alive. So a lot of parasites of this kind, there's a lot of different wasps that are attacking prey and laying eggs in their bodies. And in most of those cases, those baby wasps, they want to suck every little bit of juice and energy and resources out of that host, because the more they can eat, the more they can store, the more eggs they can lay in the future, more offspring they can support. But as soon as you are trying to keep this host around as bodyguard, you need it to be alive. And so she was looking at how this trade-off was playing out, where the parasites that decided to leave more resources behind for the ladybug were more likely to have a protector, whereas the parasites that sucked more of that tissue, that ate more of the ladybug, were more likely that that ladybug would die and then they would be left alone. So she was kind of trying to tease apart some part of that biology.
That is absolutely crazy. And
yeah, it's pretty wild.
Does the ladybug still kind of go about its business? Like, does it find food for itself, or does it fly at all, or does it basically just stay on top of this thing the whole time?
In that week that it takes for that larva, the parasite, to metamorphose, the ladybug doesn't go anywhere. It just stands there. It doesn't eat. It just sort of wiggles around. And if the ladybug has enough kind of fat or resources to survive that week-long process, it can actually regrow its internal organs. The mind control effect wears off, and it goes on and makes a full recovery, which is crazy.
Wait, so the ladybug will actually just become normal again?
It can, if it's able to survive that period.
Oh my God.
If those baby wasps have eaten too much of it, it may starve in that week, in which case, it'll die.
That's wild. Do they have any sense of like what the wasp does to the brain, or at least that controls it?
There's a few hints. So they don't know the mechanism, how this happens exactly, but what they've identified is a virus that lives in the ovaries of the wasp and gets injected into the ladybug at the same time that its egg is laid. The wasp lays its egg, so it then sends these viruses in there with them. Those viruses then migrate into the brain of the ladybug, and they stay there. Their presence in the brain of the ladybug corresponds to the timing of this mind control behavior. Mm-hmm. So what that means is that if the ladybug survives for that week, when it recovers, you don't find the virus anymore.
Oh, interesting.
So that's not enough to say exactly how this is happening, but other scientists have worked out how wasps and viruses work together to control their hosts, to trick the host's immune system and do all these other sophisticated things. These are with different wasps and different viruses, but that mechanism has been worked out in other places. Okay. So when they identified this virus and they're identifying these patterns, they're thinking that this is pretty strong evidence that this virus is playing some role. What role exactly? How that virus is doing this to a ladybug? There's still a lot of unanswered questions there that people are working on.
And in those other examples where they find like a correlated virus that goes in, the virus somehow rewires the circuitry? Is that how it works?
In the case, for example, there's another wasp that attacks caterpillars. And what the virus in that case does is it helps trick the immune system of the caterpillar to not be able to detect the virus, the wasp. So the wasp babies get injected into the caterpillar, and instead of the caterpillar just destroying those things as foreign objects, as disease agents, you have this virus that's able to help hide them from the immune system. And then it's actually also changing the metabolism of the caterpillar so that it's eating more in order to feed these parasites. And it may be doing other things like preventing the caterpillar from metamorphosing itself into an adult. So it's changing the kind of life trajectory of this caterpillar, and it's changing the immune system in order to help serve the wasp parasite. So it's actually three different things, all right. A virus, a wasp, and a caterpillar, all kind of interacting in a ridiculously complicated way.
It's crazy how, specific some of these parasites can cause such specific behaviors in the host. When I was looking at toxoplasma, it was the first time I'd ever heard of something like this, and my mind was absolutely blown. And then looking at your work, I'm like, oh my God, you can actually find handfuls of examples of these out there.
Yeah, it's not rare. It happens a lot of different there's a lot of different examples of these host manipulating or mind controlling parasites.
So I want to dial it back now that we've kind of started off on a fun note, but kind of get a sense of what brought you into this line of work. Were you somebody who has always had an affinity towards science and nature? Or?
When it came to science and the outdoors, it's something I've always been interested in. I grew up hiking around, exploring my backyard in Atlanta. I grew up on basically what used to be dairy land.
Okay.
And then it turned into a suburb of Atlanta. There's lots of woods and streams that grew up in these old fields. And so there were lots of salamanders and bugs and birds to find. It was just a fun playground for me. And it was something that my older brother and sister did. And so I went outside to follow them. My parents took us camping. All my friends were into camping and outdoors. My school promoted that too. I went to a Montessori school, Arbor Montessori, that they took us on camping trips too. So everything around me was about exploring the outdoors and learning about nature. And so that started at a very early age.
And did you go to school for photography or more biology?
I was planning on being a biologist.
Okay.
So I went to Berkeley for undergrad with the idea that I would study biology, go to graduate school, be a professor somewhere. And I kind of got derailed halfway through my time at Berkeley.
And was there kind of a defining moment where while you were working at Berkeley, you kind of moved towards the photography direction? Was like, I can make a living off of this? Or was it something that was a passion project on the side and then just started to build up momentum?
There wasn't a defining moment, but there was one opportunity that started this process going, started this ball rolling. So end of my sophomore year, I got an email from a graduate student instructor, Sean Ravito. He wrote to me. He helped teach a class on natural history where all of us would go out every week for 4 hours and to a different park in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we'd learn how to identify birds and salamanders and snakes. And I had my camera along because it was a hobby. My first real relationship with photography was as just a fun way to document my hikes and adventures and document the interesting creatures I found so I could show my friends who didn't go out that day.
Right.
And so I applied that approach to these field trips where we'd find salamanders and I'd photograph and say, oh yeah, this is what we found today. And this guy, Sean, he was helping teach the class and he saw me with my camera every week. And he wrote me an email at the end of the semester saying, hey, this photographer is looking for an assistant. I see you with your camera. I thought this would be an interesting opportunity for you. And he had the phone number of David Lichwalker.
Okay.
And so I called him up. This is 2006 in the summer. And he just needed somebody to carry a backpack for a project he was doing. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know who he was. I went and met him at his apartment in San Francisco. And he said, yeah, this is a magazine story for National Geographic. We're going to go to Sequoia National Park and track down 28 species of cave-dwelling bugs. And I need your help.
That's cool.
Get the equipment down there to find these bugs and to help me take photographs of these.
And so was this something that you had to leave school for, or was it something you could do on the side?
Not initially. So this was over the summer. It was just 2 weeks.
Oh, okay.
In June. And so that was during summer break. We got along really well. I thought it was a blast. I got to rappel into these caves. I got to look for cool bugs that scientists had just discovered. I got to work with a cave biologist. So the biologist in me was super excited to work on a natural history story. The photographer in me was excited about seeing how a professional photographer lives and works, and I was getting paid for it. So,
right.
Whoa, this is cool. And we got along well, and he invited me to Hawaii for his second story. And so that I skipped a couple weeks of school in September of that year. But that was pretty easy. I could sort of make up classes and assignments. It wasn't too disruptive. But, the more I worked with him, the more I wanted to work with him, the more he wanted to work with me. And so that was senior year, I basically withdrew from Berkeley.
Okay.
I had 2 classes that I needed to finish to graduate, and I finished those. Actually, one was an international studies class, which I got the dean to just waive. I was like, okay, I'm going to go to South Africa, Costa Rica, and Polynesia this semester to work for National Geographic. Or I have to say no to that in order to take an international studies class at Berkeley. They're like, you know what? I think we're standing in your way. Why don't we just decide to not do
That seems fair.
And then I took the other writing class online. And so I graduated on time in 4 years, but my last year was traveling, working on another couple of stories with David.
And at that point, were you like, this is what I want to do? I want to go this way? Or was it still like, this is fun, I'm just kind of sticking with it for now?
No, it was actually a really hard decision to stick with photography. Well, where was it really? I mean, I was stuck in between these 2 modes where on the one hand, what I was doing at the moment was as fun, as amazing, as exciting as anything I could imagine. Flying all over the world, climbing trees in the Costa Rican rainforest, and snorkeling on the French Polynesian coral reefs. I couldn't believe how much cool stuff I was getting to do.
Right.
At the same time, I did not want to be a photographer. I did not want the instability and insecurity of a freelance career. I saw how David lived. I mean, he was a successful photographer. He had been for decades, and he was still kind of stressed about where the next paycheck and where the next job was going to be coming from. And so at that time, I still saw photography as a way to inform where I was going to go to graduate school and what kinds of questions in biology I was going to be interested in. And I saw this photography assistant gig as a way to just have a broader perspective on science and natural history. Each of these stories was about natural history. Each of them put me in contact with a biologist from NOAA or from the Park Service or from independent consultants. And I thought, okay, I'm getting an experience here. I never got it as a student at Berkeley. And 4 or 5 years of this is going to mean when I become a graduate student, I'll have a way better sense of what interesting work is happening in the world.
That makes sense. And did you ever go to graduate school?
No. So initially I was like, I'll take a year off after undergrad. And then I was like, how about 2 years? And then how about 3 years? And eventually I thought, I don't think I can go back. This is too exciting, too much fun, too much freedom to really choose what projects I want to work on, who I want to work with. And so eventually I just kind of committed to making a go at photography. And I got more and more opportunities. I got to work for other photographers as an assistant. I eventually got a grant from the National Geographic Society called an early career grant. And just, I was getting encouragement from all sides. People liked my photographs. I was getting funding to do my own projects. And it just seemed like this is working out. So as long as it's working out, it should stay the course.
Right. And was there a time when you got one gig? Like, what was your first gig that you were assigned to do on your own where you made that step from assistant to the lead?
So there was a bit of a transition there. So I was assisting for a while. I got my grant was kind of the first independent photo project. So I applied, at the time it was called a Young Explorer grant. And they gave you $5,000 to go do a field project. It's now called Early Career. They give you, I think, 5 to 10,000. And I proposed a project to go to Patagonia, the Argentine side. This is, southern South America, and to photograph the wetland biodiversity that lives in this region.
Mm-hmm.
And so doing that, it's not quite the same as an assignment, but it meant I could I could go to DC and I could show my work to editors at National Geographic and say, this is what I've done with your grant money. And they didn't publish those photos, but it opened the door in the sense that they knew who I was. They were interested in staying in contact. They saw some potential. And so they started, just saying, okay, well, what else do you want to work on?
Mm-hmm.
And so the first assignment I got was a one-day assignment from an editor at National Geographic to photograph fire ants in Atlanta. And this happened again pretty just really lucky timing. So what had happened is she had gone to another photographer who I was going to work with, Maria Stenzel, and asked her to photograph these ants. And I was with Maria at the time, and Maria said, I'm too busy. I'm in the middle of moving. But this guy who's working for me, Anand, is going to Atlanta next week. That's where this lab was that they wanted to photograph these things. So Maria just said, why don't you hire him? And because I had been an assistant for so many years, I had worked a lot on macro photography.
Right.
I was this young explorer. That timing and that past experience sort of came together to give me that first gig, and that turned into a couple more. And those one-day assignments then meant when I brought up this idea of Parasites, they were willing to take a chance on me. I was more of a known entity than just a random grantee or a photographer.
And where do you go about looking for stories that compel you enough to say, I want to pitch this? Like you're talking about wetlands in Patagonia and mind controlling parasites that seemingly are in very diverse spaces. And then you have hummingbirds and mushrooms and bats. It just seems like, is it usually something where Nat Geo is like, okay, we need this type of thing? Or is it something just really scratches an itch that you need to go and explore a little more?
I mean, really, all the projects that I'm proposing come from conversations with biologists. So conversations with friends of mine. That's where this first mind sector story came from. One of my friends, Sarah Weinstein, who is a classmate of mine at Berkeley, went on to do her PhD on parasites. We was just having a conversation one day. She said, you've got to do a story on these crazy mind controlling parasites. And I'd known about one or two of them, but she gave me examples of a few more. And I thought, yeah, wow, there are a lot of crazy examples. I wonder how I would photograph that. And hummingbirds was similar. I had a friend, Chris Clark, who was a graduate student at Berkeley when I was an undergrad there. And I followed him around with a camera, and he started including me on grant projects. And so I would travel with him. I still am traveling with him all over Central and South America, tracking down hummingbirds.
That one hummingbird shot at 3,000 frames a second is insane.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
So
absolutely
all
insane.
that comes from, working with these scientists and seeing what the work they're doing, what the work their colleagues are doing. And so I'm kind of bridging this gap between the science that's already been done and then recognizing, wait a minute, there's visual potential here that the scientists aren't taking advantage of. They've discovered that this is how a hummingbird dries itself off, but the cameras they're using to analyze that are not as high quality, high definition, in color. And so I'm just bringing in the tools from the photography industry to make this stuff look cool.
Well, it makes a lot of sense knowing your backstory now I think your photography specifically has such a beautiful marriage between the science and the photographs, which is a really kind of niche type of or unique approach that you take to it. So going a little bit back onto the parasite, what do you think is the most mind-blowing or interesting one, crazy one that you've found?
I think probably they're all amazing in their own way. But this emerald cockroach wasp is one that felt the most sophisticated. So this is a wasp that attacks cockroaches. And because the cockroach is too big for it to overpower, it's figured out how to design a venom that can take control over its brain. So what it does is it has special sensors on its stinger, and the wasp sticks its stinger into the brain of the cockroach. The sensors feel around so that it can figure out where exactly in the cockroach's brain to target. It then injects this venom that knocks out the part of the cockroach's brain that controls the motivation for movement. So rather than just paralyzing the whole cockroach and dragging it off, which it can't do, the thing's too big, it just turns the switch off in the brain that lets the cockroach decide to run away by itself.
Wow.
So it's just sitting there, and then the wasp tugs on its antenna, somehow that stimulus is there. There's still a bridge in the cockroach's brain that takes the stimulus and it tells the legs to start moving.
Right.
And so the wasp has figured out how to basically rewire this cockroach's brain to listen to its stimulus instead of the cockroach's own fear response or decision making skills. So that's crazy to me that a little bug, a little wasp, can make these very specific changes in order to eat a cockroach. I mean, in this case, it's
Right.
laying its egg there, and the egg eats it. But think about a lion or a tiger. Okay, maybe there's some sophisticated coordination happening with the lions, communicating with each other to sort of attack the zebra and outsmart it. But this is like a whole different level, and we think about insects being sort of simpler, dumber animals,
Right.
that are just kind of flying around and grabbing stuff and eating it, and mammals and birds being so much more intelligent and sophisticated. And I'm not saying that a wasp is necessarily more intelligent, but it's figured out such a complicated way to overpower its prey. It really makes me rethink how the diversity on our planet is organized and how the complexity of our planet is way kind of underappreciated.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild. I mean, the nuances and how interconnected and balanced everything in the world. Even I saw that photo you had of, was it a mite or something on a hummingbird bill?
Yeah.
And can you elaborate as to like how that mite survives?
Sure. This is one I photographed in Colombia, and actually it's very common. I don't know if all hummingbirds have mites living in their nose, but it's very common where there's a whole group of mites. These are tiny, relatives of ticks that are so small they live in the nostril of a hummingbird, and they don't actually feed on the humming. They're not really bothering the hummingbird as far as we can tell. They feed on flowers, on nectar and pollen.
Mm-hmm.
They just use the hummingbirds as transportation, and so they can detect when a hummingbird is feeding, and when they detect that the hummingbird is sticking out its tongue, they jump out of the hummingbird's nostril and they run all the way down its bill to jump onto the flower. And you have other mites that jump onto the bill and run up into the nostril. And so if you've ever seen a hummingbird feed on a flower, it's what, a tenth of a second,
Right. It's
a
fast.
quarter of a second per flower. And so in that time, you have a tiny little bug running up and down their hummingbird's bill. And so, it's at a certain scale, our planet becomes very bizarre.
Yeah. In the more you can humanize an animal, I feel like is the level of intelligence that we typically attribute to that animal. And so insects just seem so far removed from anything that you would view as normal human intelligence. You just think they're small, but the systems that they've created, intelligence might not be the right word, but the systems they've created are so complex, and what they do is so fascinating that it never ceases to amaze me.
Yeah, definitely.
So, and on the insect front, I saw your TED Talk on bees, which was great. And I know bees are a subject across America that people are starting to get growing concern about. With, I think Honey Nut Cheerios even removed the bee from their cereal box for a little bit to bring awareness. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with bees, and have they rebounded at all since your TED Talk? I think that was in 2015.
So, the story I did on honeybees for National Geographic is one of the stories that National Geographic actually asked me to photograph. So I both proposed stories and they asked me to cover stories. And, that was a challenging story to do just because that issues around colony collapse and honeybee declines had already sort of been out for about 10 years. 2005, 2006, that's when these issues first came up at the scale that we're seeing them now. And a lot of stories had already been done, and I was kind of struggling to figure out, well, okay, what can I contribute to this conversation? Hasn't
Right.
everything already been told about what we know? So I took a certain track of visiting scientists and showing their tools for studying honeybee declines. And in a certain way, my understanding is that the issue has stabilized.
Okay.
In a sense, it's not getting worse every year, but it's stabilized in a place that's very challenging for beekeepers compared to, the 90s and early 2000s. And so beekeepers are losing a bigger chunk of their colonies every year than they used to, and they're able to then replace those bees that are lost by splitting their hives, by kind of growing up their population again. But if you're losing more and more, a bigger chunk every year, you have to put way more resources into managing the pests and the pathogens and the stress levels around your bees, and you have to put a lot more money and hours into managing them, and that becomes financially really difficult, economically really challenging. So, the honeybee is not going extinct anytime soon. I don't think that's an appropriate way to think about this issue. But the way that I think about it is that we have become so dependent on this one species to pollinate a lot of our food that our system of our relationship to bees and how we use them to produce food has not particularly resilient. We're
Right.
so focused on using these bees kind of to help us, and we've so focused on selecting for certain traits of how much honey they produce or how gentle they are. We created a system that was not particularly resilient to new diseases and new pests and new pathogens, and so there is a serious issue about like trying to maintain enough bees to meet the pollination demands of our food supply. But there's a lot of issues around that, in addition to the pesticides that are out there and
Right.
the diseases that are out there, about how we raise bees and how we sort of think about that system more broadly.
How would big ag pollinate crops without bees? Is that even possible right now? Is there technology for that?
So for the crops that need insect pollinators, you really have to rely on native pollinators if you don't have honeybees, and that's what we used to do. I mean, there used to be tens of thousands of species of insects that we relied on that were already in the environment that would pollinate our food for us. And so as we changed how food was grown, we kind of pushed a lot of them out, and that's why we are so reliant on honeybees now. So without honeybees and native pollinators, native bees, then you're kind of relying on hand pollinating, which is what some parts of the world that put too many pesticides out have had to do. And actually, it's important to point out, I think, beekeeping doesn't really happen at in the same way that we think about corporate agriculture. So there's really no corporate beekeeping that happens.
Right.
It's all essentially family-run businesses. Some of those businesses are very large scale. You do have commercial beekeepers, but even those, I mean, I worked with Brett A.D., who, along with his brother, runs 70 to 90,000 beehives. So that's not a small operation, but it is something that his grandfather started. And so to keep bees is a very intimate process where you get to know these animals, and you have to care a lot about them to be able to maintain them and to be able to maintain that business. And so it's actually not something that gets done in a way where you're sort of just hiring out a bunch of people to do a job and you have investors to make money off of selling honey or pollination services. It's just not profitable enough to attract that kind of scale and investment. And that's part of the challenges around it, is that beekeeping is becoming a harder and harder business to stay in because of things like colony collapse and mite problems and all these stresses. And so that's one of the factors that makes this challenging. Is like as bees get harder to keep alive, it makes less and less sense and less attractive to bring new beekeepers into that business. And so there's all these factors, kind of environmental factors and economic factors that swirl together to make this complicated and in a lot of ways interesting, but
yeah,
important.
I honestly had no idea that beekeepers were even used on the scale that they are until Netflix recently released a documentary called Rotten. Have you seen it?
I've heard of it. I haven't seen it.
It's all about how there's a lot of conspiracy and a lot of honey that's produced around the world, and that particularly in the East, there's a lot of fake honey being sold to the Western countries. But it talks about even when these beehives collapse, how much money that's lost for like a mom and pop shop that might be harvesting or raising bees. But also there's a lot of theft that goes on where beekeepers have actually set their bees out to pollinate these crops and then come back, and some other beekeeper just taken $300,000 worth of bees from them, which is, it's a scary thought. I mean, I guess if you're intimately involved, you understand the behavior of bees a lot more. But for me, the idea of letting out $100,000 worth of bees in the hopes that they're just going to come back to their hive must be like something that worries you every day.
Yeah. It's not a business I would get into if you're trying to make money.
Yeah,
easily.
But I think that's a cool example too, where a lot of times, especially with urbanization being such a huge trend around the world, it's easy to lose sight about why wildlife is important. And I think something like bees is a great example for the fact that without a healthy bee system or insect pollinator system, there's huge downstream effects to the human population.
Yep, for sure.
So I want to go in a little bit about a story I saw you did with bioluminescent mushrooms. And when I saw it, I think it was still pretty early stage in the research behind it. Just interested to see if there's a little more. But in a nutshell, where was it? In the Amazon?
That was the Atlantic forest of Brazil, so the eastern coast of Brazil. Yeah. Okay.
There's essentially these mushrooms that glow in the dark, and scientists at the time didn't know the reasoning for the luminescence.
Yeah, so that was actually the last story that I assisted David Lichwater on. So that was he was the photographer for National Geographic, and at that time my role was to shoot the video for these projects, and so I made a short video working with the biologists who are trying to unlock this ecological secrets of these mushrooms. So these mushrooms produce their own light, and they were trying to figure out, okay, well, why would that takes a lot of energy to do. It takes a lot of resources. So why would you do that? There's got to be some reason for producing so much light. And I'm trying to think, that was several years ago, and I think there have been some updates on that. I haven't stayed completely on top of where the latest research is. At the time, the thought was maybe this helps spread their spores. They're attracting insects, and the insects are picking up their spores and helping them spread through the forest. There was another hypothesis that maybe there's insects that are feeding on this fungus, and the light attracts predators to come in and hunt those insects. And so I don't know if they've collected enough information and enough data to really answer whether either of those things is happening, or if there's a third hypothesis. That's something I haven't checked in on in a couple of years. But and just another example of just really cool, surprising science out there that, these mushrooms are bright enough. You go out on a moonless night and you can just see these little glowing green orbs. It feels like you're walking around in Avatar.
Oh, so they're not, I assume they were like, you find one, like they're hard to find. Like you go into the right places and you can see them all over the place.
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily like a forest that
Right.
you can navigate based on the bioluminescence, but I mean, we found dozens of them, yeah, and
Oh
they're
my
big,
God.
big, 3 or 4, maybe even 5 inches across was the largest one, and I mean, yeah, you can see them glowing with your naked eye. It's not a subtle.
Something I'm really interested in photography of the natural world in general is kind of going through that forest with the bioluminescence at night. But also, I listened to a podcast you had sent me that you were on where you were talking about one of your first assignments going into, I think it was French Polynesia, and filming at night in the ocean, or photographing at night in the ocean. Both of those scenarios seem very scary to me. Like, just, I don't know. There's something about being part of the world that you're not quite as accustomed to being in, and it's dark, and there's creatures you're looking to photograph that you're not sure where they are, where they're coming from. Do you feel that at all? Or is that just a switch that you can't turn on if you're in the line of work that you are in?
I do, and I find it interesting to be just uncomfortable enough to be focused.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily seek out dangerous situations just for the sake of the thrill of it, but being out on a reef at night or being in the forest at night, it's unfamiliar and uncomfortable enough that your senses are tuned way up
Right.
and you're super aware of everything that's happening and you're just nervous enough that it's just a different way of being in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You're just much more present. You're much more um, focused on every detail and all your sensory inputs. And I think that's a really interesting. It's a stimulating and exciting way to explore a new place. Um, but I don't necessarily like being in a dangerous situation
Right.
or in a unsafe situation where you're not properly prepared or you haven't done the research and you're not in control over the risks that are there, or not aware of even the risks that are there. I don't think of myself as reckless in those ways, but I like being prepared and then pushing my comfort zone just enough to feel like I'm learning something new and experiencing something new.
Have you had an experience where it kind of ventured too close on the danger side?
Yeah. Early on, after my Young Explorer grant in Argentina, a volcano erupted in Chile, right next to the place that I had spent a few months, and that volcano dumped an enormous amount of ash over the course of a year. And actually, 6 months after it, I decided to go back. So this eruption happened, and this ash continued to flow. And as it was coming out, I decided to go back and photograph how this ash was changing the landscape. And towards the end of that trip, I had been working, hundreds of miles away, and then I decided, okay, I should photograph this volcano to
Mm-hmm.
show what the source of all this ash is. And I did a little bit of research. I found a trail that would go towards this vent where this ash was spewing out. I talked to a volcanologist. I wasn't able to put together a team to go with me. This was low budget and early in my career, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And so I went off by myself with a little bit of background information and having talked to local experts. And I had protective gear with me. I had a mask and goggles, but the wind turned and it kicked up all this ash, and it meant I couldn't see anything.
Oh
And
man.
my ventilator clogged. I thought I was suffocating, and I just thought, and I could feel the
Oh
grit. So
God.
the ash is just ground up ground up glass
Right.
that gets in your lungs. It's really bad for you, and I could feel it in my mouth, so I knew it was getting in my lungs, and I felt weird, and I don't know how much of that was my own hypochondria and imagination, but I felt like my lungs didn't feel right for many months, maybe even a year. And I spent that year thinking about, okay, well, I'm still alive, but did I do, long-term damage to my health just to get this one photograph? And
Right.
is that worth it? Obviously, I believe in making sacrifices to do good work. But, sacrifice can mean you get 2 hours of sleep a night, or you work really hard, or it means, you shorten your lifespan.
Right.
And that's the first, and that happened early on in my career, and that changed how I think about risk and risk assessment and how I make decisions when it comes to my work and my life.
So how'd you get out of there? Was there a point where you're like, I'm going to suffocate? Or was it a pretty quick thing? There was
a moment that I thought that, but I had brought the right tools with me to get out of there. So I had a GPS that I had recording my path the entire time. So when the visibility dropped, I could follow that sort of breadcrumb trail, because I couldn't see anything. I couldn't, my trail was covered. My path had been covered. I couldn't tell what direction I was looking. I could see a few inches in front of me. And so I had a GPS that could help me backtrack. I had enough cartridges to my ventilator that I thought I was suffocating, but when I changed them, I could breathe okay again.
Okay.
It turned out that I had enough of the right tools. I had prepared enough ahead of time to get me out of that situation.
That is scary, though.
Yeah, that was the first time that, I had enough time to think through the consequences of my decision. Sometimes, an accident happens in an instant, and then you figure out how to recover from that. This kind of unfolded more slow motion, where I thought, okay, yeah. What have I done here?
Right.
Am I going to get out of this? How is that going to work? And if I get out of this, how would I do things differently going forward?
I mean, yeah, it's a good lesson to learn, I guess, in hindsight.
Yeah, definitely.
I wanted to talk a little bit too about, it sparked my mind when you were talking about Chile's, the amphibians in South America in general. I just finished reading The Sixth Extinction probably 6 months ago or so, and I had no idea that amphibians were suffering as much as they are, and are one of, if not the fastest declining class of animal right now.
Mm-hmm.
So just was interested in your work down there and any updates on that.
I haven't worked on amphibians in South America specifically. I did work with a number of years ago with Vance Friedenberg, who was studying chytrid fungus. So this is one of the big drivers of amphibian declines, is this fungus that infects their skin and it kills them. I think this is again something that I haven't kept up on in the last couple of years, so I don't know what the latest theories of its origin or what the current effects are. This is a fungus that is new to North and South America. At least the current form of it is new, and it was really just wiping out populations and species left and right.
Where was this?
Throughout. I mean, I photographed Vance's work in California.
Oh, okay.
But this is, chytrid was spreading through Central America and into South America, and so there were frog extinctions in Panama and Costa Rica, I know of, and I believe in Ecuador as well. Now, whether those declines have slowed, I hear less about it in the news right now.
Yeah.
But it's hard to know when that's because a problem has gone away versus the news has just shifted to other problems.
Right.
So I haven't kept in touch with Vance or other chytrid researchers to know. What the last that I heard is that there were, this disease sweeps through a population. Some species go extinct. Many of them get knocked back 90-95%.
Damn.
And then you have few tiny little populations that somehow survive that had resistance to it. And so I know that they had identified a couple of these in California where they thought the mountain yellow-legged frog was going to go extinct. And they were able to identify some places where, for some reason, they were able to survive. They were designing strategies to try to protect populations that hadn't been infected yet. So I photographed this experiment he did where he figured out there's some of these frogs that survived this wave of fungus infection had a bacteria in their skin that prevented them from getting killed from this fungus. And
Okay.
so he would figure out how to take that bacteria from one frog in the lake and put it on all the other frogs in the same lake. So he would grow the bacteria in the lab and go back out into the field, catch all the frogs, put them in little Tupperware containers, give them a bacterial bath, and that saved that group of frogs
Oh, wow.
from the next year when the fungus came through. So there were still, but that wasn't necessarily going to work in Madagascar or in Philippines or in other places where chytrid was feared to do the same damage. And so the last kind of check-in I had, that there was promising results of new treatments, but there was also complications of how to scale that across the world. And
Right.
I'm not currently working on amphibians at the moment. So
What is next for you? What's the next big project?
I'm not sure. I'm spending a lot of time with David Gruber at the moment. He's a marine biologist who studies a wide range of really fascinating things. I mean, he worked a lot on bioluminescence and biofluorescence, so identifying different compounds in corals that fluoresce and even turtles.
Oh,
And
wow.
thinking about how what role that plays in the ecology of coral reef systems. And so we're thinking about doing a collaboration in the future together on some sort of marine biology topic, but that's still early on, and I haven't really nailed down what the next project is going to be.
I was just talking with someone yesterday who was saying they just found, I think it was a bioluminescence, if you shined a UV lights down in puffins up by Alaska, their bills, those like brightly colored bills.
Yeah, so that would be fluorescence.
Oh,
So
fluorescence,
bioluminescence is you're putting out your own light, and fluorescence means you're taking certain wavelengths of light and reflecting a different color. And so that would make sense with puffins. Birds can see ultraviolet light that we can't, and so they're communicating. I mean, there's more to their color and their plumage than what we can see, and so I don't know that case specifically, but what that would mean is that, if you're shining UV light on them and it's reflecting back visible light, it's telling us something about a secret way that their patterns that they're seeing and communications that they're having that we're not aware of. And that's very similar to what David Gruber's work has focused on in the past underwater.
And in turtles specifically, there's bioluminescence, and where have they found that?
So there's fluorescence.
Oh, fluorescence in sea turtles.
And
Sorry,
so that means that, it just means that there are patterns on their shells that they can see that we can't. And that's helping them camouflage and as well as communicate.
Oh, wow.
In ways that we didn't know before.
If you could, this might be a hard question, but if you could think of one day that you've had as a wildlife photographer that was your most exciting or interesting or exhilarating, is there one memory that comes to mind?
I think the memory that sticks with me as one of the strongest and the most surprising was this night on Moorea. Moorea is an island in French Polynesia, and I was working as an assistant, and I was collecting the creatures that passed over the certain spot on a reef. And I would go there during the day, I'd go back at night, and I was there at night, and it's very shallow water. It's not way out in the ocean. It was next to the coast. And I had a flashlight and my snorkel, and I would just watch these creatures appear in the beam of my flashlight. And the stuff that showed up out of the darkness just felt like I was flying through outer space looking at aliens. I mean, baby pipefish, a baby flounder was about an inch long, totally transparent, landed on my goggles.
Wow.
My mask, a nudibranch. This is a kind of a relative of snails and slugs that lives in the ocean, and it had these purple polka dotted flaps that it was pulsing to move through the water. I had no idea what it
Wow.
was. It's just this weird thing that I caught, and I put it in a jar, and it would settle on the ground and turn from like a radially symmetric flapping donut into this snail or slug that was sort of cruising on the bottom. And the way that they would transform when you put them in a jar, and the details you could see once you got up close and looked at them under a microscope, it was just like, I'd been interested in the ocean and I had kept aquariums, and I knew a lot about, the biodiversity of coral reefs, but to then be there and see a whole nother layer of diversity and complexity and beauty was astounding. And it has stuck with me for 10 years now.
That's amazing. I've never scuba dived, and I've really wanted to get down there just because it is funny. I think the underwater is literally an alien world that so few get to experience like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when we talked a couple weeks ago, we were discussing kind of the intersection between conservation and how you view your work in relation to conservation. And I thought it was a really cool and unique perspective.
Sure. Obviously I care a lot about the conservation of our planet.
Right.
I don't necessarily label myself as a conservation photographer, and I typically don't talk about conservation directly. So when I do a story about hummingbirds, I'm not doing a story about how to protect hummingbirds or about endangered hummingbirds. And likewise with parasites, these are not species that need protection at the moment, for the most part, or I'm not necessarily focusing on that angle directly. That's not to say that I don't think that's important or that I don't really value and celebrate the photographers out there who are really focusing on conservation issues and talking about conservation and elevating that in society. I just feel personally that I don't necessarily respond to that kind of messaging very consistently. So what I mean by that is when I see stories about polar bears or about elephants or about endangered species that have a very direct sort of conservation appeal, I find myself not responding emotionally. Like I feel kind of that I've already been saturated by that kind of messaging, and that's those stories. I think, okay, I kind of know what to expect, or I don't want to feel this way right now, or I'm tired of feeling guilty or afraid or scared about this or worried about this, and I don't want to deal with this right now. So I'm going to go look for another story, or I'm not going to finish the story because it's off-putting to me. And so the way I think about how I want to communicate and the stories I want to tell, I think about how do I focus on celebrating diversity and sparking a sense of wonder and curiosity. And what I hope is that by doing that and by trying to build relationships between people in the natural world, people will find their own motivation to conserve what they care about. That's appropriate for their context, that's appropriate to their values. And I'm not telling them how to feel about a certain thing or how to prioritize the resources in their life. I just want to get people to be curious about the world and do with that what they feel is right.
I think there's a really important piece to that where I was talking the other day with another wildlife photographer, and we were discussing how disconnected a lot of the human world is now with nature, and that a lot of conservation and the love for nature comes from a sense of wonderment and excitement about the planet Earth. And a lot of times creating that conservation can also be elevated through creating wonder from species that aren't necessarily struggling. Like, for instance, like when I first found out that a hummingbird flapped its wings however many times a second, I saw a hummingbird outside my window when I was hanging out in New Hampshire, and I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And like it helps to fuel the fire as to just caring about the natural world. So I think there's a really important piece of that it's beautiful in a way that it's allowing people to connect with the world around them in a way that's positive and really just gets people excited about it. And in turn, I think that it helps to solve the issues in the same way, because it gets people caring or having more of a reason to care about the species that are struggling. And there's definitely an equally important place to learn about that and understand that and figure out how you can help that. But I think a lot of caring about those issues comes when you have a genuine love for the world, and finding out stories about just how amazing animals are and how unique they are and how specialized they are creates that sense of wonder and appreciation.
Yeah.
Do you know Tim Ferriss? He's my favorite podcaster, but
I don't.
He's the guy who wrote 4 Hour Work Week. Okay. But he interviews a lot of people who are top performers in whatever field and kind of dissects how they become so efficient at what they do. But he always ends his podcast on a question, which was, if you could stick a billboard on the middle of the 101 or the middle of the highway that people could go by and kind of preach one message that you would like to kind of disseminate into the world, what would that be?
I would say, I mean, my best crack at that would be pay attention to the details around you. I think that's what has driven my approach to photography. That's what has been the most rewarding for me, is to focus in on one thing, on a subject, on an idea, or on even just a flower, a piece of bark. And you slow down and you sort of just sit with this thing for long enough, and it's not hard to find something new. And in my case, my work, I end up sitting with this thing for months or even a year, and I'm trying to unlock as much new visually interesting things there. But I think you can do it every day. I think you can do it anywhere. And I think, at least for me, finding those like little visual puzzles and gifts in the objects around you and the creatures around you, it's just endlessly fun and rewarding.
I think that's great. And I think it's a great parallel to have everybody who doesn't know or hasn't checked out your work before to please do it. It's some of the macro photography and videography on your website and on your Instagram is some of the most fascinating stuff I've ever seen. Especially, I mean, my personal favorite, if you go to the TED Talk and watch the first 21 days of a bee, that was some of the most insane footage I've ever seen. And if you look at your work, I think paying attention to the details is something that certainly is a good message to end this podcast on. And I really thank you so much for taking the time. And where can people find you? I mean, I'll link everything in the show notes, but if there's anything else to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, website. I think, honestly, Googling my work, I'm sometimes not as up to date on my website as I should be. So if you Google my name, you'll find all my work on National Geographic's various media outlets. And yeah, that's probably the best way.
Well, thank you so much for all the work you do and for taking the time to chat. I'm a huge fan and really stoked that we were able to sit down. And for everybody, until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.